welcome to City as Gender. When we say city as gender, it's rather odd because we usually think of country and gender. You think of Bharat Mata, you think of a motherland. The Germans have the fatherland. You don't normally think of city as gender. So I'm going to start with a small story. In 1970, can you all hear me? Yeah. In 1970, the great French hero Charles de Gaulle died. He was 90 years old. He was one of the great figures of of the 20th century. He fought against the Nazis, liberated Paris, etc. When he died, the French president at the time, Georges Pompidou, said famously, "Charles de Gaulle is dead, France is a widow." It was a beautiful line, and here was France like the bereaved wife. But when Charles de Gaulle entered Paris, he famously said, "Paris is broken, Paris has been betrayed, it has been liberated, he is the enemy." So the enemy were the Nazis, they were a he. France is a she, but Paris was an it. Sharon, is Paris a he, she, or an it?
I would say that Paris, for most of its history, has definitely been a feminized city. Paris is the city of love. Well, I think the most important thing to say is that Paris is an obsessively heterosexual city, so that when people think about Paris, they think about men and women coming together. And when you think about the kinds of stories that would be a typical Parisian story, the kind of thing that you think taking place in Paris, that would be when a man meets a woman or when a man loves a woman, to cite the name of a very famous, popular 1960s French film. But Paris itself, when we think about how Paris is symbolized, it's the city of elegance, of refinement, of pleasure, of sensuality. It's very much thought of as a woman. And just to give you an image to associate with that, although the big symbol of Paris is, of course, the ultimately phallic Eiffel Tower, although even so, it's a metal lacework, and so it's a very delicate phallus, if one can say that. In 1991, I lived in Paris, and the city put out a new poster to symbolize the subway. So every time you took the subway, you saw this poster, and it was the shape of the line of the Paris line as it went from east to west, made to look like the upturned face of a very lovely woman. And it was, I found, a bit annoying in this relentlessness of figuring Paris as a woman, but it also, I think, really summed up how the city sees itself and presents itself to the world as an elegant, sensual, seductive female.
And New York has the Statue of Liberty as its main symbol. So does that make New York more feminine?
Well, New York has the Statue of Liberty, which of course came from France, and is a very robust woman. When you look at the image of the Statue of Liberty, she's powerful, holding up her lantern. She's built in a very solid way. She has a very classical demeanor. But I would say New York is a much more masculine city in its symbolics, its semiotics, how it signifies. We have the grid, the straight lines that gives a sense of engineering, purpose, movement, drive. Now, of course, as a feminist, I would say women are as capable of those things as men. And New York has always been a very open place for women who want to make themselves. And even though it's Frank Sinatra who sings, "If I can make it there, I can make it anywhere," that's an anthem for women who've come to New York over the decades. But that image of straight lines and angles, and it's a city of money and a city of Wall Street, I think that in its connotations, New York does resonate much more as a masculine city.
Thank you. So Gyan, if the Empire State, if the Eiffel Tower and the Statue of Liberty are the symbols of New York, in Bombay, we've had the most famous monument has gone, as everyone jokes, through a sex change from VT to CST. It was first Victoria Terminus and then named the Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus. So what is Bombay transgender?
I don't know if it's transgender, but like any city, it has a gender. I mean, there's no space that is ungendered. Every space is social in some way. And, while I was working on my book on Mumbai Fables, I mean, the story that came to me, which in a way captured this kind of a gendered city, which many people in Bombay know about, is the famous Nanavati case in 1959-60. For those who don't know, Commander Nanavati was a naval commander and a symbol of, patriotism. At least that's how he was projected. Handsome in his naval uniform, he looked like a man completely in control. Okay. But he had a vulnerability. And what is the vulnerability? Vulnerability is his wife, his English wife, Sylvia. And it's through his English wife, Sylvia, that this image of a man in control unravels. Because she is seduced by another man who is a kind of symbol of ultra-modernity. He's a playboy, a Lothario. His name is Prem Ahuja, and, people said about him that, Prem Ahuja would coo into women's ears, the meaning of my name, Prem, is love. And so that's how people, in a way, kind of understood the city. And when the trial went on, it was like, OJ trial in India, heavily mediatized. And in a way, it became the instantiation of the city itself. So not only was Nanavati on trial, the city itself was on trial, and a heavily gendered city where the entire drama was a kind of a gendered drama. So this has been, sort of part of it. And, I think of cinema, for example, I mean, which is associated so much with Bombay. But also, cinema in general. So after Mumbai Fables, I just mentioned I wrote a script for Bombay Velvet. And there, too, the story, the main protagonist is a guy called Johnny. And his ambition and desire, in fact, is fastened on this woman, jazz singer Rosie. And she is his passport to success, but also his downfall.
Yeah.
So, in a way, his fate is heavily connected to the kind of a gender drama.
Gyan, to go back to the Nanavati case, you said it was like the O.J. Simpson trial of Bombay, and there were like thousands of people waiting outside the High Court to get in. So it was a bit like Bombay's honor killing, wasn't it? It was like an honor killing. And the crowds were baying for him to be freed. They wanted him to be set free. They didn't want the death penalty. They didn't want him, because they said he was protecting his wife's honor. And in that way, their honor and the society's honor.
Yeah.
And so what does that say about the city's, what does it say
I
about
mean,
the city's values? And
well, I mean, he was projected as, since he was a naval officer, and so the tabloid Blitz kind of really ran with the story, and so he was projected as defending the nation's honor on the seas, while his wife was being seduced by this Prem Ahuja. So in a way, it was a crime against the nation itself. Okay, and so the defense of the family and defense of the nation, they all came together. And so no wonder in the kind of a last jury trial in India, the jury acquitted him. And, New York Times covered the story. New Yorker actually did a wonderful story about, women throwing, hankies smeared with their lipstick on Nanavati saying, will you marry me? This was, so on the one hand, he was that kind of a defender and embodiment of the nation and the family. And at the same time, he was also vulnerable. And therefore, the honor must be avenged. And so, people spoke and thought, he should be acquitted. Yeah. So it's very clear that, people, including women, saw this whole episode through kind of gendered eyes.
okay. Adaf, coming to you. Adaf lives between Cairo and London for many years now. And a few years ago, I think after the Arab Spring, her editor in London said, you know, now it's finally time for you to write that Cairo memoir. You were not saying you're going to write it all these years, now it's time. And her first reaction, as she writes in the introduction to her book, was fear. She says, I was afraid. I didn't want to write about Cairo. Why?
Well, it was actually for many. I signed a contract to write a book about Cairo, and that was maybe 20 plus years ago. And then I didn't write it because I felt every time I tried to start that it sounded like an elegy, because throughout the 90s, throughout the first part of the 21st century, the city was very, it wasn't a sad city in that when you went there you felt sad. It was a sad city in the sense that if you loved it, you felt sad for it, because of not only the neglect, but, well, the willful neglect and the attempts to turn it into something else and so on. So with the revolution in January 2011, when Alexandra Pringle, my editor, said, okay, this is the moment to write the book, I felt afraid at that moment, because it was clearly going to be a book also about the revolution, and therefore there was a very, there was a sense of responsibility. There was a sense of speaking for the city and for people, but it also felt like the right moment and the happy moment, because the city was being re-embraced and revitalized, and it was finding its people again.
So her book describes those 18 volatile, mad, wonderful days when the whole city of Cairo rose up at Tahrir Square. And I remember one commentator in America, Fareed Zakaria, he quoted that famous Shakespeare of, I think, Henry V, saying that these are the band of brothers, and the man who is not present at Tahrir Square will curse the day that he was not present there. And he called it a band of brothers, but it was also a band of sisters, wasn't it? Were a lot of women out there.
Yeah, it was the predominant sense was that everybody was out there, that it was a space where suddenly everybody was free and everybody was equal and everybody was welcome and everybody had a role to play. It's a little, it feels a little odd now talking about it like this, because we're so encouraged to think of what happened as some kind of communal hallucination, but it wasn't. And those of us who were there insist that this is really how it was. And we have the the film footage, we have the memoirs, we have the recordings to bear this out. But the fact is that suddenly women were able and expressed this. This was expressed many, many times, that women said that for the first time they felt able to be on the street in a public space without any fear of being harassed, of being molested, of being annoyed in any way. That women were, we had a sit-in, so people basically camped out. They stayed in the streets. And we say Tahrir for shorthand, but it was really in lots of places and in lots of different cities in Egypt, and Tahrir came to stand for them all. But people were staying out. They stayed out for the 18 days and nights, and of course we now think it was a mistake to go home at the end of them. But anyway, so women were also sleeping out there on the street, and you had the spectacle of like women in Western dress, women in hijab, women in niqab, everybody being able to be there to talk to each other. And and actually to express the feeling that why were we scared of each other? What had the Mubarak regime done to us for so long that we were all sort of locked up into our little boxes and afraid of each other? And we shouldn't. You heard people on the phone telling people outside Tahrir, you should come. I cannot tell you what it's like here. Everybody, nobody's critical of anyone. Everybody's looking to be their best and do their best. And for women, it was a tremendous, tremendous sense of liberation. And of course, it's not then surprising that when the counter-revolution strikes back, one of the forms, and a very central form in which it strikes back, is by basically setting up gangs to harass, to molest women. In a very organized, very systematic manner. And that also the revolutionary fight against that was in young people, both men and women, forming groups with various names, Tahrir Guardians, Opantish, Harass Map, to actually set up something like military operations to watch out for groups harassing, isolating, attacking women, and move in to break them up, to fight, to take the woman out, to support. And that these were very consciously non-gendered groups that were taking this on. So very central to the whole ethos of the revolution.
And one thing you learned from your book, which is that a sort of off topic, but that Tahrir Square is not a square. It's not a square, it's a semicircle, right?
It's not even that, it's just a kind of...
a Maidan.
Yeah, because square is an English word, of course. But the Arabic Maidan is, I think it exists
we say
here
Maidan,
as well,
yeah,
exactly.
yes.
It's an area, it's an open area where it's common. Anybody can walk into it, and it's somewhere where a certain activity takes place. So, yeah. And so a Maidan can be any shape.
Thanks.
And Tahrir is just a space of no particular shape.
Okay. Sharon, to come back to you. You live in New York. And when people think of New York, they think it's like safe for women, great for women. They can go wherever they want, they can do what they like. Is it that free? Is it as it's made out to be, or is it for different women, different challenges?
I think every city in modernity offers the option of mobility and freedom. That's the dream we have about cities, and they're designed for movement, for connecting different neighborhoods. They have public transportation. When we think about cities, we think about streets, plazas, boulevards, cafes, theaters. And I'm a scholar of the 19th century, so I'm very conscious of the ways that in the 19th century in Paris and London and New York, world cities, that women were explicitly seen as not part of that mobility. Women had to be, if they were middle class or upper class, they had to be with chaperones to walk in the city. Working class women were routinely harassed by men of all classes who thought if a woman was in the street unescorted that she was available to them to be talked to, addressed, followed, grabbed. And I think the idea is that in the 20th and 21st century, with the advent of feminism, and certainly we imagine these problems have gone away. What has gone away is the overt expectation that women should not be in public. New York is certainly a city that has always, for the last 50, 60, 70, since the 1920s at least, but even in the 1880s, women have been seen as expected to come out in public. So around the 1880s, you have the establishment of the ladies' mile, and middle-class women are expected to come out to shop, and consumerism has always been very important to the American economy. But expecting women to be out in public and protecting women's freedom to be in public and guaranteeing that women can be in public with the same degree of peace and security that most men take for granted in public are two very different things. So I would say that in New York, what we call street harassment remains an enormous problem. 2 or 3 years ago, a group called Holla Back, which encourages women to harass their harassers, essentially, to not just take harassment as a given, the price you pay for going out in public, but if someone harasses you, to say to them, stop that, don't talk to me like that, or less polite things, depending on how rudely you've been addressed. This group, Hollaback, they found a woman who was willing to be part of this experiment. They asked her to put a camera on while she walked. And she walked for about an hour in Brooklyn and then in Manhattan. And she was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, a very regular, ordinary outfit, not especially revealing. She was a woman in her 20s with long hair. And the camera recorded how men spoke to her. She was harassed 40 or 50 times in the space of 2 hours. And the video was put online. It went viral. It, I think, exposed what every woman is already aware of, that especially, I think, for my experience and that of many of the people I talk to, is it's very related to age. So any woman under 40 can't really expect to go, especially in summer and spring and fall. Winter, it's a little better. Everyone's wearing these bulky down jackets and nobody talks to anybody because it's so cold. But come spring and you put on a tank top and sandals and go outside, and you really can't, it's just taken for granted. You cannot expect to walk in peace. That's something that makes me very angry. I think a lot of women have just decided to ignore it and not pay any attention, but when you start talking with other women about it, and when you saw the reaction to this video, nobody really thinks it's okay. Nobody really thinks this is the best way to live. And one of the best responses to the video that I saw really highlighted the way that this is a price women have to pay for living in cities, but I would say for living. I mean, women are subjected to sexual harassment and sexual violence in much larger numbers than men, although it's not exclusively a problem that women alone face. And it's a way of controlling women's ambitions, controlling women's movements, controlling women's sense of possibility. So one of the funniest responses highlighted how different it is for a man walking in the street. And what they did was they got a guy to mimic the video very, very precisely, but instead of being harassed, he was the harasser of other men. And his way of harassing other men was to walk up to every man he saw and say, high five, high five, high five, like insisting that men greet him. And I thought it was a very telling way of highlighting the difference. Certainly, I think there are issues with crime where plenty of men are worried about being victims of crime, and that's a different kind of issue. And crime rates have fallen enormously in New York in the last decade, so in general, people have a much, a sense of invulnerability that is, to me, as someone who grew up in the city in the 60s and 70s, relatively new. But there was a sense that the worst thing a man can worry, the most a man would worry about if he's walking in the street is that people might be too friendly and say hello. But when you saw what people were saying to this woman, it was not hello. It was extremely vulgar, sexual, aggressive, hostile remarks, and sometimes being very angry if she ignored them. So it's very hard to advise women how to handle this kind of harassment. You ignore it, say something. And so I would say that it's something that women are always thinking about in New York, but it's seen as not leading to actual danger, so it's more of a nuisance.
So you said this woman was walking down with the video, I mean the one who was being filmed, and there were about 40 or 50 episodes. Or so people say things, or they try to
people comment
touch
on her breasts, people comment on her body, they tell her things that they'd like her to do to them sexually, they tell her things they'd like to do to her sexually. Some of it is a little, you know, some of it is people saying, hi, baby. So if you just read, someone said, hi, baby, it sounds okay. But when you see the way they're doing it, you realize it's quite aggressive. Threatening is maybe another question. Nobody attacks her. She 40, 50 men talk to her in this way, and nobody actually tries to physically touch her or attack her. But "Hi, baby" is the least of it. It's extremely, much of it is extremely sexually explicit, and I would say highly aggressive. It's Hollaback, Hollaback, and if you Google Hollaback video, you will get to see what it's like to be a woman in New York walking down the street.
Okay. Well, Bombay women have faced much worse, I think. That and not just verbal abuse, but you really have to walk with your bag in front of you when you're walking down a subway. It's really terrible. But of course, Gyan, in India, we say that Delhi is like the worst city. And if anybody was asked Delhi's gender, I mean, it would be masculine without thinking. Why? Why what makes a city?
I don't know, maybe it's because Delhi is associated with power, state capital, and therefore it's assumed that it has a kind of a masculine character. But this is standard where people say, Mumbai is safer for women compared to Delhi, and that may have something to do with the way in which kind of an urban fabric has developed in Mumbai, where kind of public life and public interactions are part of the city's history. There's a thing of safety in numbers, and the kind of geography that we have in Mumbai, where work and life are not separated, like in Delhi, where you have defense colony, where people live and the market is somewhere else. So the streets are, never crowded in the same way in Mumbai. In Mumbai, you step out of the house and, there are people. So there's strength in numbers, and that makes it kind of safer for women.
Adaf, at the Tahrir Square demonstrations, there were a lot of women. But there were also all these reports about, some of them being arrested and put through what they call these virginity tests. Can you tell us a little more about what led to that, what they were trying to prove, and how many women had to roughly go through all this?
Well, that was a very specific event, and it was, basically, there isn't any kind of really solid agreement on when the counter-revolution started, but it probably started the moment President Mubarak left office, the moment he abdicated on the, the 8th of, or the 2nd, whatever, of February. 28th, the 11th of February. And he left, he put the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces in charge. So the military was kind of delegated by the outgoing president to look after the country until we could go into elections. And SCAF, the military, really started to fight the revolution overtly from that point, but gradually. So I think it was the 8th of March, 2011. Now, there were ongoing demonstrations, even though people left the sit-in, the big sit-in in Tahrir and in other places. There continued to be street action, there continued to be protests as people were pushing for the reforms that were the demand of the revolution. And so in one of those, March 8th, the military went out, and at this point, the police were not anywhere. On the 28th of January, the police were kind of beaten by the revolution, and several police stations were set alight, although one has to say that the revolutionaries made the policemen come out. They didn't burn them, they just burned the buildings, and they were very careful, actually, not to harm anybody. But the police kind of ran away and was nowhere to be seen for months. And so the military stepped in, and it was the military policing the streets. And bit by bit, they rehabilitated the police so that eventually they were working together. And you can see the progress of that here. in those terms. So 26th of February, the military attacked people and arrested and so on, and started putting civilians through military trials. On the 8th of March, there was another episode, and it was in that one that they arrested several women. They arrested men as well, of course, but they arrested, I think it was 16 women, and it then turned out that they put them through what they called virginity tests. Now, the reason that this came out was because when the women were released, they talked about it. And not only that, but one of them, a very brave young woman, Samira Ibrahim, took the military to court. This was unheard of for anybody to take the military to court for something they had done to them, anyone, man or woman, and then for a woman to do it, and then to do it on a case relating to something sexual, where you're just supposed to internalize what happened and be ashamed of it and be quiet. And this was also a woman from a very conservative background, from Upper Egypt, but her family stood by her and encouraged her, and she took the military to court. And eventually, she won the court case, and the military declared that this was a wrong procedure and it should end. Now, two interesting things here. One was the amount of public support that this gained, and she had named the particular army doctor who had done this, and this was done to them in a separate room, but in a room that had windows open onto a corridor where military men were coming and going, a door that was open, and it was done in a way that was calculated to be humiliating. So she had named him, and people got his picture and got his phone number, and the graffiti that appeared on the walls, which was like his picture, his phone number, and other graffiti where it was like a battalion, say a battalion of military men, all with his face and with a tank and with her sort of like huge, like some goddess figure on the top. So the amount of support that she got was phenomenal. And at that point, the media was also free and was behaving like a media. So that was reflected on the TV chat shows as well and so on. The other interesting thing was that the military put somebody forward to talk about why this had happened and to justify it. And so the general who stepped forward and talked about it said that this was because the women were being taken from a protest, they were going to be detained in a military prison. And they had no military prison facilities that were only for women. So there were going to be men guards there, for example. And so they had to make sure before the women went in which of them were virgins and which weren't, so that the women couldn't come out of the military prison afterwards and say, I was a virgin and I was raped or I was deflowered in prison. So it was almost put, it was put on a par with taking a note of your possessions. You know, like you hand in your watch and your rings and so on. Well, you can't hand in your hymen, but you can sort of prove that it exists when you went in, and therefore you would expect it to be intact when you came out. So this was the justification that the military gave, and did it with a completely straight face and with no sense of wrongness or even absurdity. And the person who gave this statement to the media was the head of military intelligence at the time, and that was General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who is now our president. So this is what we're dealing with right now.
It got a lot of coverage, of course, and a lot of support, which was very good, yes. Sharon, we wanted to talk about New York and race, and how different races might be treated differently, women from different races.
Well, before I do that, I actually want to say something about women and revolution in cities, because what you are talking about is reminding me of the Paris Commune of 1871. And in Paris is a city of many, many revolutions. So interestingly, on the one hand, it has this image of sensual pleasure and elegance, and in between there'll be revolutions where often the way that the revolution is understood, especially later by historians, is as a complete overturning of order, which is what a revolution is, and that includes the gender order. So in the revolution of 1789, the sense is that there are working class women in the streets and they are attacking everybody and they have become the rulers. And this is a sign of both how thorough the revolution was, but also how disruptive and dangerous it was. And then in 1871, there's a Paris Commune where the workers take over the city for a brief amount of time, and then the middle class and upper class leadership brings in the National Guard, and there's a massacre of the communards. And in the mythology afterwards, both the pro-commune side and the anti-commune side, the obsession is with the female communards. And the sense that how bad can things be, or how extreme must the revolution be if women are taking up arms, if women are being so aggressive. And the sense as well that to overturn the revolution and to undo the work of the revolution, you must put women back in their place. And that place is understood as regressively and conservatively as possible. And so in the period following the Commune, there's a sense that women should be in the home, men should be outside, order must be maintained. And I think it's just important to keep in mind that revolutions are flashpoints around gender and have been for a long time. So in thinking about this panel, I was thinking about what kinds of stories do cities make possible. And Paris, the stories have always been about the young man coming from the provinces. So someone who comes into this big metropolis is a bit of a hick and a country bumpkin, doesn't know how to make his way around, and then often with the help of an older, sophisticated woman, learns to make it in this complicated city and rise to the top of its power structure. And you have some of that with New York too, especially in the 19th century, the Horatio Alger story of the young boy who through his industry becomes a capitalist and himself a captain of industry. But in the 20th century, New York stories have really been stories about women finding space, finding themselves, and achieving things. And New York is the key place in the United States where those stories get told. And if you think about television, I can tell you plenty of novels where it happens, like Rona Jaffe's The Best of Everything, or Jacqueline Suzanne's Valley of the Dolls, although often those are stories that go like this. The women make it, and then they find they can't have it all. They can't reconcile love and ambition, and so something always goes awry. Sex and the City and Girls are two TV shows that I think have really tried to take those stories and give them happier endings. But when I think about the kinds of stories people tell about New York, I think it's also really important to think of cities as having not only a gender, but cities being places where people work through the relationships between different races, different nationalities, different ethnicities, because of course cities tend to be much more heterogeneous and diverse. They tend to be magnets for immigrants and migration. And New York is certainly seen as a very African-American city. Harlem is a capital of jazz and African-American culture. New York is one of the many northern cities that people migrate to from the South at the beginning of the 20th century. And so I just thought on a panel about gender, we should also talk about race. And what's interesting is when I think about the great New York stories about race, many of them are about men, not women. I think there's James Baldwin, there are the authors of the Harlem Renaissance like Claude McKay. Recently, there are starting to be more stories about women of color in New York, and I think that's a very interesting development in contemporary literature, so I want to mention two. One is Jacqueline Woodson's Another Brooklyn, which just came out this year and is about 4 young African-American women in Brooklyn who become friends in their teenage years. You can think of it as the Anti-Girls, which is a TV show famously about 4 very white women in their 20s. And another is a novel called Bright Lines by an author named Nandini Islam, which is about a Bangladeshi community in Brooklyn. and focuses on two teenage girls at a pivotal time in their lives. So I think we're starting to see stories of women who are not white women who are really using everything that we think about when we think about New York. Its possibilities, its space, its endless ambition.
Thank you. Gyan, even Bombay is the site where the young man comes from the village and makes it here. And you wanted to talk a little bit about how city and cinema are so closely associated.
Yeah, but just before I get to that, I mean, I just wanted to pick up this point about, the question you raised about race and gender. And in Mumbai's case, let's say, if you're thinking about ethnicization of Mumbai with the rise of the Shiv Sena, what I find interesting in the rise of the Shiv Sena is not just ideology of, kind of Marathi Manus, but in fact that the ideology is embodied. That when the Shiv Sena emerges in the late 60s and the early 70s, one part of its kind of a rise is this sense of kind of a masculinist energy, that there are these young men who will get things for the Marathi youth, not by petitioning, but actually taking action. There's a whole kind of a charisma of direct action, and that this kind of a masculinist action will provide what, normal politics hasn't given them. I remember when I was doing this research, I was interviewing someone who's a kind of a local ethnographer, and I was asking him, so tell me, how is it that in all of these, working class neighborhoods where communists and trade unions were once powerful, how is it that their children became members of the Shiv Sena? And he said, the thing was that, communists were talking about some utopia, but the Shiv Sena came and he said in Hindi, tonic diya. They came and gave him tonic. And suddenly they were empowered. And with this kind of, direct action, going to a police officer's house, slapping him and saying, now you do something, this was far better than, waiting for elections and, working through democratic institutions and so on. So there's a way in which the city was gendered through, the rise of the Shiv Sena. Yeah, but coming back to film, I cannot dissociate city from cinema. And there are many sort of examples. One that I really want to talk about is film noir, and the first one, Double Indemnity from 1941. The interesting thing about the film is set in Los Angeles. So you have this a very orderly suburban Los Angeles family, and you have this insurance salesman. Now, you can't imagine someone more mainstream than an insurance salesman, And the insurance salesman is invited by this woman to come and sell insurance for her husband. And of course, she's a femme fatale, and it's a plot to kill her husband and collect the insurance money. So suddenly this kind of world which is so orderly and completely, mellow, is thrown into complete crisis just because you have a woman. So, I find that often what happens in cinema is that the lens of gender is used in order to paint a certain kind of portrait of the city and understand its crisis, And the crisis is always kind of around gender. And then if you shift from Hollywood to Hindi cinema, and if you think of all the kind of Devanand films from the late 50s and 60s, which drew a great deal from film noir, although film scholars don't use the term film noir for those films and call them crime melodramas. And there too, you have you know, Devanand was a kind of a very urbane character. I don't think of any film in Devanand where he's wearing a dhoti. He's always a kind of a stylish, urban kind of flaneur. And so there's a film called Taxi Driver, I think, which was made in the 50s, mid-50s sometime. And it's very interesting in that film where his girlfriend, Kalpana Karthik, through the film, so she's come from the countryside, to make her name she wants to be a playback singer in Hindi films. But through the film, she passes off as as a man. She dresses as a man because that's the kind of a male world that he lives in. And yet, the film manages to paint a picture of friendship between men and women, which is, part of, city life, where often relationships are based on fictional ties, on friendship, rather than kin, clan, family, or something like that, And so there's this character called Lily, and Lily is a kind of a singer, and, she flirts with Devanand, and there's a kind of a very flirtatious sort of relationship, but it's not sexualized. And this is the kind of a world that, he paints. So someone who comes from the countryside and comes to the city now encounters a world where relationships between genders are, rather different and based on some kind of, friendly relationship rather than, family and so on.
As you know, Adav, Gyan was talking about the Shiv Sena, which is a local political party, and how its rise sort of masculinized Bombay. Your book also mentions during Mubarak's regime, though he was anti the whole Salafi movement, but it sort of gained ascendancy during his time and was influenced by the whole Wahhabi Islamic movement from Saudi Arabia. How did that affect women in Cairo?
Well,
it was a more conservative, hardline brand of...
Yeah, it's just that we're sort of so beyond that now. Everything is like post-revolution. Things are different. But basically in Egypt, as I guess in lots of other places, the rise of the organized political Islamism, if you like, there are two lots. One is the Muslim Brotherhood, and the other is the Salafis. Now, the Brotherhood are kind of more, or were more visible, because because they're an organization, actually, and the Salafis, there are or were many more of them, but they're not organized. The Salafis kind of like believe in the ideal society that is themselves. Salafi means to adhere to the ways of the ancestors. And so they are for literal interpretations of the Quran and the Hadith, for example. You have like ridiculous discussions about, well, if you're a Salafi, then why do you use a motor car, or why do you use a telephone? And then it's, because technology. So anyway, their thing is to adhere literally to the ways of the past and to shun modern society with its sort of godless practices and so on. So they marry amongst each other, and they kind of have their own businesses with each other and so on. But until after the revolution, the Salafis were totally against having anything to do with politics, because politics, by definition, is compromise and is dealing with people who who believe things other than you, and so you retained your purity by staying away from politics. After the revolution, when there was sort of like a scramble for power, and nobody was sure who the military would back, they formed a political party, which is still there and still active, called Hizb al-Noor. And of course, they actually win seats because they can just issue orders to their people to come out and vote. Because again, with the Brotherhood and with the Salafis, a very high premium is set on obedience. And interestingly, that is why a lot of young people, and some even of the not so young stars and leaders of the Brotherhood and of the Salafis, left them in the run-up to the revolution and in the time immediately while it was happening and immediately after it, because they realized that that obedience was no longer an option for them, that they needed discussion, they needed interaction with the other young people who were out there. So yeah, I influence is much broader than being on the women. It's an entire way of life.
Has the dress code changed? Have they sort of more conservative dressing, things like that? Not really.
No, not really.
Not
No,
really.
I mean the hijab is now the sort of just head covering is now most people, most women wear. I mean the statement is not to wear it. It's a general thing, and it doesn't really signify anything. What signifies is the niqab, the face covering, and that is much more a Salafi thing than a Brotherhood.
Okay, thank you. So we've run out of time and open the floor to questions. City as gender, if anyone has any questions for our three panelists.
Hello, yeah. As we all know that urbanization or re-urbanization happens in a globalized scenario where, you know, cities have to urbanize themselves so that they could identify themselves as something in a globalized world. So, taking an example of France and Milan being the fashion capital, does these, like a profession or a thing like fashion, does it make Milan a feminized city?
Okay.
Or does the economical factor play an important role in the gender identity of an urban space?
Sharon, I think
I'll start. I think it certainly can. I think that in general, economic production and earning money and possessing money and having control over money is gendered male, despite the reality being much more complicated, and that spending money is gendered female. So the fashion industry is an interesting example because despite it being very feminized, as we know, it's dominated by men. Men who take it upon themselves to tell women how to dress and how to look. And I think that the question, I'll digress slightly to say that we haven't really talked about sexuality in cities, but of course in the 20th century and well before that and in the 21st century, cities are also known as gay capitals and as places that challenge traditional gender divisions and challenge traditional ways of men and women relating, which I think you're bringing up also in talking about this movie Taxi Driver, which sounds fascinating and which I want to see. I would also say that if I think about New York, that New York is a global finance capital, and that has contributed to being a city that I think is in many ways gendered very masculine, a city where there are masters of the universe who, you know, there are many women in Wall Street, but it is still very much a male-dominated area, and Wall Street dominates the New York economy. And New York is a very global city in terms of tourism, but its main global economic engine is not manufacturing, it's Wall Street, it's finance capitalism.
There's a question there.
Thank you. I just wanted to pose this one question, which is, on the one hand, most certainly freedom for women, at least in Bombay. I think in many cities, but especially in Bombay, is really growing, and one has seen it. I live here and I have experienced it and enjoyed it. There are liberal ideas, women dress as they want, whether it's short or long clothes, it doesn't matter. But at the same time, in the last few years, maybe even a decade now, harassment of women, and even worse, have increased. I don't think it is just a matter of more reporting. I think there is greater harassment. I mean, we as sociologists try to explain it by saying there are more women out in the public and therefore more. But I think there is a certain kind of hostility at a deeper level, maybe some kind of a threat that women are, beginning to dominate maybe or even come out in the public domain. But this is a problem that I find, I wonder if it is also happening in other cities. Thank you.
Yeah, and I was thinking, as you were talking about, I was thinking of a case a few years ago was it Phoenix Mills or in one of the mills? And one of the things that actually struck me about that incident is, so there are two things happening. You have more and more women, as you noted, in public space, active, visible, and at the same time, the kind of globalization that's occurring is also making the city more class divided. And so you have, on the one hand, women in public spaces, and you have more and more poor people, basically, who have no access to cultural goods of the city and feel completely sort of alienated from the public life that they see in the city, and that produces this kind of, violence and anger, which takes this kind of a gendered form. And so I do think that, there's some connection between the greater presence of women in the city and the nature of kind of a class division that's occurring, more and more in cities like Mumbai.
Wait for the mic.
We can't hear you.
Okay. Just one sentence. I know it's not a dialogue. But I think in your comment, and I totally agree, this kind of commercialization that has happened, and consumerism, and it is really offensive. But the fact also is, as you said, it is taking a gendered form. Men also do flaunt, their cars and their clothes, and I do not know whether crime against men of this kind, out on the open, on the road, it is gendered, and that is of some concern. I wonder if this is also happening in other cities where consumerism is, as blatantly visible as in our cities. I'd just like a comment if anybody's interested.
Well, I'll comment very briefly that it's an important and excellent question, and one that's almost impossible to answer. Has street harassment ranging from the verbal to outright attacks and rapes gone up? Well, we collect a lot of data on rape in the United States, but it's a notoriously underreported crime. No one collects any data on harassment. It's not even technically considered a crime. If you try to report it to the police, you'd get absolutely nowhere. And we rely simply on anecdote to try to know if it's increased or not. But I think what I would say is that it's something that has existed well before there was a feminist movement and continues in the face of increased you could say, well, in the past it was unusual to see women walking in the street alone, so men thought they could treat those women as, in effect, prostitutes. Now it's extremely common to see women walking on the street at all hours of the day or night in New York City. It hasn't made harassment any less. And it's very hard to know if it increases in response to a perceived threat of feminism. It's a good question, and one I wish we had the tools to answer.
Last question.
Hi, this was actually addressed to the previous response from Gyan, when you said that there is this huge angle of class which comes into gender violence, and I disagree with you, and I'm not sure how much, to what extent. Okay, so you took the example of the Shakti Mills case, that's the one you were looking for. The thing is, there were two cases. There was one of the Shakti Mills case, and there was a previous case where a mill owner's son had raped a much older woman in a mill in Bombay. This is about a 5-year period before Shakti Mills case. So, I mean, I just wanted to illuminate the fact that there is class, but I think class operates mostly on the angle of who gets prosecuted and who gets penalized more than who's assaulting whom. I mean, there is that angle, I just don't think that that's so much.
I understand that class plays a role in prosecution. But you know, and this is also connected to the previous question about the relationship. How is it that a kind of a class deprivation manifests itself in gender violence? Okay? And I think that is partly has to do with the kind of entrenched position of gender in the organization of society. And so when you have a kind of a deprived male confronted with a form of modern life that he cannot have, the thing that he fastens on as a kind of an ultimate defense is in the realm of gender. Okay? I'm not kind of saying that this is necessary, but it seems to be the way in which kind of a class violence. I mean, one could say, why doesn't he just take on his anger against a rich man, and why against a woman? But I mean, I do think that there is somehow in gender he finds a way to defend his deprivation that he cannot defend any other.
I mean, I would just riff on that to say that it seems that men will accept that some men will be superior to them, but it's deeply offensive to them that any woman might be superior to them. And also, I think to take up a point you're making and reverse it, that it's almost impossible to imagine a woman who feels deprived, a woman who's a poor woman, taking out her resentments on an upper class man, even doing it, and just imagine the wrath that would ensue, the prosecutorial wrath, the social wrath, if that were actually to happen.
Do we have time for one more? Okay, just one.
This is a bit of futuristic question. How about having global cities wherein people from different parts of the world come and live, and after they retire, they go back to their respective countries?
Did you hear?
I didn't.
Can you repeat? We couldn't hear.
This is a bit of a futuristic question where you have people from different parts of the world coming into a city, and after their retirement, they go back to their respective countries. That sort of.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Anybody wants to answer? No. Thank you very much.